He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Hi, I'm Paul Roy, and just a word of warning. This series contains graphic descriptions of rescues and fatalities, as well as some spicy language. Although at times confronting, they are the unfiltered reality of the work of land search and rescue volunteers, and those that have been rescued. So if unsettling personal stories affect you, a strong cup of tea might be in order. Episode 5. Middle Peak Hotel.
So I'm attending a search and rescue training exercise at
Aoraki Mount Cook.
Regrettably, I'm about to be hoisted at the end of a long sling and flown into place to observe the training techniques. And I'd have to say I'm not entirely looking forward to swinging around underneath a helicopter with a good 500 metres underneath me, but it's good to experience what these guys do every day. Yeah, the helicopters dropped the first two off and it's just coming back.
The mountains around Aoraki Mount Cook are the highest in the Southern Alps and have attracted climbers since the late 1800s, many with their eyes set on the highest peak itself. Since those earliest attempts, when pioneers with primitive equipment slogged in by foot, to today's easy access by chopper to well-established huts, these soaring peaks, Mount Tasman, Sefton, Douglas, Île de Beaumont and Aoraki Mount Cook itself, have been the scene of many dramatic rescues and deaths. So much so that an alpine cliff rescue team has been based at Mount Cook Village since the early 1970s, the only paid mountain rescue team in the country.
So I've just been deposited at the end of a 50-metre cable onto a tussock ledge, a few hundred feet up from the valley floor, and it was quite a ride. Today's a very benign day. There's no wind, good visibility. To do this for real in a rescue situation with sometimes poor visibility, high winds, getting people into narrow spaces, sometimes at night, then it's a different matter again.
At the heart of today's story from 1982, two men in their early 20s, unlike each other in many ways, but both driven by the urge to climb.
So I was born in Geraldine in South Canterbury into September 1959, so next month I'll get my gold card. I think I'm looking forward to that.
This is Mark Inglis, who I talked to at his home in Hanmer Springs on a crisp afternoon following heavy snows.
I turned up at high school 1971 as an 11-year-old, and the only game in town was rugby, of course, or as I called it in the day, thugby, because I was the skinniest little piece of whitebait you've ever seen. And I was just dead lucky in that I had a geography teacher, Bert, and Bert was a mountaineer, and he took a few of us under his wing. So basically from the age of about 12, our school sport was tramping and climbing. When we were 16, Ross, Shane and I, we got within 300 feet, 100 metres of the summit rocks of Cook while we were on a school geography trip. Mind you, we hadn't told the teachers we were doing that. We'd told them that we were going to camp out on the Tasman.
For a 16-year-old, getting this close to the top of Aoraki Mount Cook is not to be sniffed at, and perhaps an early indication of Mark's tenacity and drive.
For me, it just became like climbing does for so many. It's that sense of achievement, that constant sense of achievement, and especially when you're not a traditional team player, it's something that just becomes addictive.
Far from Aoraki Mount Cook, Nainai out of Wellington, another young man was being introduced to the hills, around the same time as Mark.
We were just moving into Wellington, into Kelburn, where I went to Scouts, and that's where I started tramping and went to the Tararuas. And of course, that's where my story about search and rescue really starts.
This is Phil Doole, a gentle and unassuming man whom I met at his house in Richmond, near Nelson.
We went to the Northern Tararuas when I was 15 going on 16. Our trip got knocked around by the weather. Ironically, or whatever you say, that we were on a peak where the guidebook of the days did say you have to be careful in misty weather. Getting dark, our leader went off to check the route, but he never came back, and it got dark and it was almost snowing, certainly sleeting. The three of us, so we have to get off the tops down into some shelter. And then the next day, the storm had gone, we decided to follow the creek out. They put on a big search to find the guy, and unfortunately they couldn't find any trace.
Didn't put you off, Phil?
No, not sure why. Maybe we were bolstered by the fact that we managed to get ourselves out. We might not have made the best decisions, but we made some that, make the situation worse than it was.
So quite an introduction to tramping for 15-year-old Phil, which mirrored Mark Inglis' lifelong fascination with the mountains.
I moved down to Dunedin to go to university down there and join the Otago University Tramping Club, as you do. And then we started on those training courses at Mount Cook, Aoraki.
3 years younger than Phil, Mark Inglis was finding his own way to make a life in the mountains.
I tried to find a route into mountaineering, and that's when I went to Lincoln College as it was then, and I got accepted into the Park Ranger program. I was one of the few climbers of the intake, so the first thing they do to send you for your 6 months of field experience is, well, naturally, they send Inglis to Cook. And of course I never left. It's like I realised I didn't want to be a bloody park ranger. I wanted to be a mountaineer.
Phil, meanwhile, was doing his own mountain apprenticeship while juggling a career as a surveyor. During a holiday in his early 20s, he tackled Aoraki Mount Cook with a friend.
So the thing I remember about going to Mount Cook is it was sort of like it's something you did, and it might sound like bollocks, but it's sort of like you had to go and climb Mount Cook, and it's sort of like you get that over with, get that done, and then you can go off and look at some more interesting stuff to do. I had a climbing mate, Graham, and we decided to go into Plateau Hut on Mount Cook.
Plateau Hut at 2,200 metres has always been the go-to hut for climbing Aoraki Mount Cook. In the early days, before ski planes and helicopters, access was always by foot, quite a journey in itself. The most commonly used and easiest route from Plateau Hut is via the Linda Glacier, which has its own hazards of crevasses and a larger than normal avalanche risk. It's taken quite a few lives over the years. Phil and his companion left the hut in the early hours of the morning for their roughly 12-hour climb and got to within a few hundred metres of the summit before turning back because of incoming bad weather. On their return, still several hours from Plateau Hut, they came upon the scene of an accident. A climber on another team of 4 had been killed by an avalanche and another one injured. And after assisting them, Phil and his mate Graham headed back to the Plateau Hut to get help.
Unfortunately, one of the snow bridges had collapsed, so we had to walk right along the edge of that crevasse out of our known route. But at some point, Graham slipped under the crevasse and I was leading, so I got pulled backwards into the crevasse, and because it was a pretty big crevasse, but fortunately it sort of had this bridge in it, or a chunk of stuff that we'd fallen on.
And how far down did you fall?
10 metres, or maybe the height of a telephone pole. Graham, he was fine, he bounced, but I didn't. Graham couldn't work out why I was screaming, but I fell and broke my femur, which can be just life-threatening or fatal. God, it was amazing that he was able to climb out of the crevasse, but he had to give it a couple of goes. And another thing that he thought to do was actually put my ice axe up to the top, marked a spot, which could have been my grave quite easily. And he walked back over the plateau by himself in a whiteout. Graham had sort of somehow slid me into a bivvy bag, so I had a cover over me. and that if it had really started snowing, I think I had this vague worry that, well, if I get covered and I still happen to be alive, or even if I die, no one will know where I am.
This left Phil with his broken femur, alone in the crevasse, with nightfall approaching, temperatures plummeting, and a storm on the way.
There's nothing could be done because of the crap weather, and overnight there was lightning and thunder, and I thought there was a war going on because I was sort of out of it, but I was still somewhat conscious. But then in the morning, they raised the alarm from the hut.
After a long rehabilitation and several operations, Phil recovered and returned to the mountains, where his path would cross with Mark Inglis. By now, Mark had been a member of the elite Alpine rescue team for 3 years and had taken part in numerous rescues.
It was a magic time, really was. It really was the golden period of national parks for New Zealand. Each park was funded separately. It had its own ranger staff. It was interesting times. We were doing exciting things. Those 8 mountaineers at Mount Cook National Park back in the day, led by Don Bogey and others, were some of New Zealand's first professional athletes, really. And it really was that whole concept of your sport, your job and your culture, all wrapped up into one. Plus the adrenaline of search and rescue, plus the incredible satisfaction of being involved in SAR. That's when you can rescue someone, or even when you need to recover a body, all of those things. So for a young 19-year-old, when I first started there, it really was the boy's own job. Life couldn't get any better, really. And you had to prove yourself, both as a search and rescue mountaineer, but also just as a mountaineer. I was climbing, and so, doing a few first ascents, and I was just really starting to understand my ability as a climber, really, but also just as a mountaineer. That enabled me to take my position as a full-time search and rescue mountaineer there.
Mark was well established at the park as a full-time search and rescue team member in the early 80s when Phil arrived.
Towards the end of 1982, so I was 25, applied for and got a summer job at Mount Cook, Aoraki National Park. You think, well, if they'd said no, because there were more applicants or something, it just changes your life. Mark Inglis he was a couple of years younger than me, as it happens, but he was the leader of one of the teams. So yeah, it was interesting times in a way, because I'd sort of come in from a sort of professional job, sort of joining this sort of vagabonds and collection of people, some of them climbers, some not, some just like to be there, it was great.
At the time Phil arrived at the park and got his job, Mark now had 3 years' experience as an active search and rescue member. And in light of what was about to unfold, it is worth hearing of some of his early experiences.
We were in the Alps, we were the Mount Cook Search and Rescue Team. So we had 8 permanent mountaineers, and then we would hire another 8 for the summer. And that was, I was one of the permanent mountaineers. At Mount Cook, you really had a search. The search and rescue was a bit of a misnomer. First time you recover a body, that was always a bit of a learning experience. The constant use of black humour to manage what would be now seen as some quite strong psychological challenges that you had, because generally when you're picking up a body, like at the bottom of the east face, it's pretty beaten up, it's pretty mangled. Back in those days, it was always the adrenaline of the rescue. It was always the trying to restrain yourself from that whole adrenaline rushing in. It's the same thing with people running around helicopters, it's the resonance of the blade that makes people panic and rush and do things too fast and make mistakes. And you add the resonance of the helicopter blades to the knowledge that you're about to get out of the helicopter into a place that someone's been hurt or killed, where they haven't been good enough and you have to be better. You're always incredibly nervous because you actually had to perform.
In those days, the 1980s and before, It was the practice to use Iroquois helicopters of the RNZAF, the Royal New Zealand Air Force, to carry out rescues, partly because the cost fell on the RNZAF and not out of the police budget, and partly for pilot training. On many rescues, this was fine, when there were pickups from an open riverbed or open tussock tops. But flying in the Alps is a whole different kettle of fish, as Mark explains.
A climber on Haast Ridge had slid down and he'd gone headfirst into a big crevasse and dislocated both his femurs out of his hips. And the Iroquois that was flying us in was hovering above the slope, and they were pointing out and just telling us to jump, and we're going, you know, it's like a 35-degree slope, we're not going to jump. You know, and so in the end we had to jump, and then they just throw your packs out because they can't pass them out because of the static electricity that the huge big blaze of an Iroquois build up. It'll zap you if you try and touch anything. And so they're just heaving all your gear out onto the slope. And then a bit later in the afternoon, when we've pulled the guy out, we've trundled him down, Ron comes in.
Ron is Ron Small, an experienced helicopter pilot with a ton of flying time in and around Aoraki Mount Cook, and a skilled rescue pilot to boot.
Ron comes in the Squirrel.
A Squirrel being a Squirrel helicopter.
And sits a skid down, and you just step in and you fly away. And it was, you know, to have the competence of and the light hands of Ron in front, you know, it gave you such phenomenal confidence in everything that you did. Would Ron have 12,000 hours when he was flying with us back then? And your average Iroquois pilot would have 300 or 400 hours. You know, it's like, well.
The pilots and rescuers saw death on a regular basis, but found ways to cope.
I mean, there was a lot of booze used. There was a lot of black humour used. We would have things like in the search and rescue room, we had a table tennis table. We'd been known to be playing table tennis while there was a body under the table wrapped up in its shroud waiting the undertaker to come up, you know, and those are the things that were seen as normal.
From the time that you hit Mount Cook, you had 3 really full-on years where you would have gained an awful lot of experience.
A lot of experience, you know, and you're still learning, you know. But, you know, there's that old saying, every mountaineer dies with a surprised look on his face. I probably would never have believed it until you do search and rescue and you can actually see it in action. Theoretically, that should make you a safer climber, but pretty much every mountaineer has probably 2 copies of the overconfidence gene. There were a lot of fatalities. You know, it seems like there was a lot more back then, but then a lot of them were people that we knew, you know, and that made it even harder. You know, the whole concept of having that professional search and rescue team at Mount Cook was to try and divorce us from the emotion that nearly always happens with search and rescue in the mountains, and that's friends trying to rescue friends, you know, and bad decisions being made. And so the whole idea was to try and be as professional as possible, you know, and so that was the environment we were embedded in.
And did you ever actually have to do that rescue a friend?
Well, we had to, yeah. I mean, we had to retrieve several friends, and that was probably the hardest.
So as a rescuer, what effect did that have on you, Mark?
Yeah, in an environment like search and rescue team at Mount Cook, and because Mount Cook itself was such a small community, everything got sorted out at the Tavern Bar on a Friday night. There were so many supportive people there as a young guy, and so it was a really tight community, and that really helped. It would be a lot different if you had to go on a search or a rescue, deal to a body, and then go back out into your own community. That would be a lot harder. It was much easier back then, and it sort of normalised it all.
It is now November 1982, and Phil has been at the park just 2 weeks.
And then Mark one day rang up, and it was probably a get to know you a bit, and it seemed like a really good opportunity.
So Phil and I decided the logical thing was for us to pair up.
Mark was more experienced than me, in the sense that I think he'd been up on the top of Mount Cook a couple of times before, and for me it was a bit more of a challenge.
So I knew a bit of Phil's history from his accident in the Linda when he broke his femur, and having that experience of being in there, buried under snow for a night. And he's strong as an ox, but big, strong, silent type.
So you had very little time together, basically, and then you decided that you'd do this climb. And was that like a learning climb together to do something?
Very, very much a training climb to get to know each other and to understand how you climb together. We'd come from completely different climbing circles, and so I didn't know how he managed ropes, he didn't know how I managed ropes, didn't understand his level of fitness, he didn't understand mine, all of those sorts of things that we needed to put together. If you're going to jump out of a helicopter, you better know who you're jumping out with. We thought we had a 24-hour window of weather and thought, go for it, we'll just learn so much.
So the two search and rescue boys decided to have a crack at the east ridge of Aoraki Mount Cook, a serious undertaking. So far, so good, but things were about to unravel in unexpected ways.
The weather had been changeable in the 2 weeks leading up, and that we were getting these sort of gaps between the fronts, like 2 or 3 days, and all other things being okay, then that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, well, we only had really limited time, and we knew that the weather was changing. The whole thing is always a juggle around that. So you take the opportunity of flying in.
In my day, the 70s mainly, I did a bit of modest climbing around the Mount Cook area, but always by easy routes. I only had one near miss, a 200-metre slide on snow over ice near Mount Green, when I stopped to light a durry when I should have been belaying my friend. Luckily we survived, but as a 19-year-old, I could easily have become a park statistic. It's my unambitious climbing and some major transalpine trips have given me the ability to assess risk factors in the mountains, the presence of avalanche danger, crossing rivers, watching the weather, and judging my own capabilities. From my own experience, there are often several minor factors that lead to things going wrong. For Mark and Phil, the fact they only had a narrow weather window to complete a difficult climb could be one.
We flew in and things looked fine.
Phil Doole,
But we actually went really lightweight, which was another sort of thing, factor in what happened.
Went across to the hut and looking at it and looking at the weather, and it was just like,
Mark Inglis,
well, we should really go right now, and then just head away the early hours of the morning.
At some point we decided, well, why wait here the night? We might as well get over to the base of the climb and bivvy out in the shrund, which is the crevasse at the bottom of the slope.
a bivvy is sleeping out under the stars with minimal comforts, certainly no tent, but by not staying in the hut, saving several hours' walk in the morning.
So we walked over there, and that involved a little bit of height gain, but was essentially fairly straightforward, cramponing across the plateau.
Mark Inglis.
The East Ridge is a massively long day, and the problem is that you get caught up high with the sun on you early on, and that can really be problematic. So the idea is to try and get up as far up the East Ridge as you can in the early hours of the morning.
The East Ridge is one of Aoraki Mount Cook's major ridges, a testing climb.
Yeah, I still look at it from the end of Pukaki and I look up and think, how the hell did I do that? It's the soaring ice ridge that runs up the edge of the Caroline face. So the Caroline is New Zealand's largest ice face, so it probably is 1,500 metres, and the East Ridge where we came out is about halfway up. And so we probably had 600-700 metres of vertical to climb up to where it comes out right on the summit of Middle Peak of Aoraki on the summit ridge. Normally that would take about 6 hours. It's been done very, very much quicker these days, but other times it'll depends on the conditions.
So what did you take with you when you went to the bivvy, and how did the night go?
Bugger all. I forgot my foam mat, so I had to sit on the rope, and so it was never going to be a luxurious bivvy. It was more about just sitting out. We took fluids and things like that and a bit of food. And the idea was just to have a quick bivvy, sit somewhere and stick your feet in your pack and just wait for a few hours and then head on up.
So the pair settled in for their cold night at the base of the main climb, intending to leave as is usual in the early hours of the morning, perhaps around 1 or 2 o'clock when the snow is frozen. Phil Doole.
We didn't really have much of a sleep at all because we were just bivvying and we didn't have sleeping bags or anything, just our duvet puffer jackets and stuff. Somehow our torches weren't working, or one of them wasn't, and so we didn't get going till first light.
This is important. The climbers have now lost valuable time waiting for daylight when they should have already been climbing using their headlamps and well up the ridge.
From where we bivvied at the schrund at the bottom, going up to that coal was quite deep snow.
Although you've got a huge exposure down the Caroline face on your left-hand side, you can walk along there if the snow conditions are hard. But we just happened to hit the soft stuff, so we roped along there 2 or 3 pitches, and that takes an hour. And then we started up the ridge leading up to the middle peak. And one of the things we did is that we kept the rope on. And you could say in retrospect we should have just gone for it. If we'd been a bit more confident in ourselves, or I'd been perhaps, we would have nailed it.
With the late start, the soft snow, and the decision to remain roped, which is not always done, valuable time in a limited good weather window was being eaten up. And on the upper part of the ridge, conditions became more difficult still.
On the day that we were up there, there was that boilerplate, the dinner plating ice, a powder covering, and then underneath just dinner plating, something chronic, and it's when you go in with your axe or your ice hammer and it just shatters about the size of an old style hubcap or a dinner plate, and it just skitters down, hits your crampon, it can knock your foot out, then you have to go in again. And so it ended up, instead of just basically in our minds envisaging just going bang, 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 bang straight up, it ended up being a lot slower and a lot harder. So it took us probably twice as long as we'd planned.
While this was all happening, were you looking at the weather, and what was the weather doing?
It's one of those insidious things in that you're climbing up in the lee. The wind's just going straight over the summit ridge of Cook. You can see the high cirrus and the mare's tails starting to build, and so it's building, but you also know that if you want to get over and get down, you just have to go as fast as you can.
And was there any stage where you looked at the option of turning back if you could see it was building up, and it was slow going up?
Because of the ice conditions, we ended up pretty committed. We always thought that it was going to be easier to go over the top.
Phil Doole.
Do that short trip down to Port of Cole, an episode or two, and you're home free. And so, we ended up taking pretty much close to 12 hours from the bivvy at 6 in the morning to topping out, at about 6 in the evening.
Talking about it in hindsight, that these things, as you said, do each little thing sort of adds up. We could see that the weather was coming in as we were climbing up. We were on the east side of the mountain, but we knew that we should try and get up, and it was a little bit more serious when we got to the top.
This is a classic climber's understatement.
And what happens when you get to the top and stick your nut over it?
Well, this was about 7 at night, I think, but it was more about the wind. It was less about the daylight. Oh yeah, it was blowing a gale, it was freight train type, and the wind just knocks you around, something chronic. It does everything to you. It turns the strap onto your helmet into this, evil thing trying to beat you to death. It's both disorientating as well as being just plain dangerous. The wind was just knocking you around. Even the rope was bowing right out, trying to blow you right over the Caroline. And you could just feel the heat being sucked out of your body, It's the one thing that is that it's hypothermia up there that kills you through poor decision making, if not through just blowing you straight off the thing. It really was quite disconcerting. And I never believed that we would be able to survive the wind from the middle peak of Bergstrand down to Port of Cole.
Phil and Mark were not the first and won't be the last to arrive at the summit ridge of Aoraki Mount Cook late. But there was a well-known crevasse that could provide some shelter not far away if push came to shove.
The temptation to crawl into Middle Peak Bergstrand, it's just, as soon as you're in there, the wind drops and, it's just like, then you can start to think again.
And so when this came across the shelter, or what seemed like shelter, our decision making would have been based on, we need to get out of the wind, it's getting late, we need to have a rest, let's get in here, get some shelter around us, and in the morning we'll carry on. At worst, because of the weather patterns, we might be here a couple of nights, but we can, we're strong enough to withstand that and come out of it without any real damage or problems.
I mean, you'd be planning on a day trip essentially, but so what were you carrying with you in terms of equipment, either sort of sleeping bags or a stove or whatever?
None of those things, bugger all. But no sleeping bag or anything, and we had bugger all food because it was a day trip.
Hopefully it wouldn't be that long. Is that pretty well what you had in mind when you went in?
Well, it's going to last 2 days, isn't it? It's the start of the nor'west cycle, and so we were in the teeth of the nor'wester, and that would last 2 days at the most, 3 days at the most, and then the southerly would come roaring on through. I'd been down there before, and it's pretty straightforward on a calm day. It would clear, you'd walk out into sunshine and finish the climb off a bit late for work.
And in a normal climbing season, Phil and Mark would have been okay and climbed down after a couple of nights in their crevasse. Not much the worse for wear, with a good story to tell.
But then we were waiting for several days and it got colder and colder and we run out of food and run out of water as well. I think we actually had one of those half tins of peaches, had a big lighter trying to melt snow in this bloody tin.
What did we have? We had sachet Raro. I think we had a wee tin of fruit. We had 5 or 6 Shrewsbury biscuits left. We had the Moro bar, which we cut a wee ledge and sat it on there, and that was pretty much our food. The worst thing was that we had very limited fluids, and we were melting between 30 and 50 mils a day.
What's that in terms of a glass?
That's a shot. That's a fifth of a glass a day. And up there, because you're breathing out, it's such a dry atmosphere, even though the storm was raging, because of the cold and everything, you're losing so much body fluids just breathing out. The good things was I went through every page of my cookbooks, and pictured every page and every meal and everything that I'd do when I got back down. Promised myself I'd always have a glass of water in the morning because you absolutely treasure water now.
The lack of food and drink, or sleeping bags, or a stove was bad enough. But the immediate danger at such an altitude, and in temperatures of minus 20 degrees Celsius, was the risk of frostbite.
What we didn't try, and again, in retrospect, it's an interesting choice, that we didn't put our feet into each other's armpits, which is one of those things that was thought to be a good thing to do. And I think we didn't do that. We would have to expose ourselves more to the open air.
You take your food off, try and massage your feet, but you also, we knew that because we had very limited food and that you couldn't open up your clothes and put your feet into Phil's crutch or onto his tummy or something, because it was just too cold. We weren't in sleeping bags or anything. And so it's like, try and keep your feet in as good a condition as possible, but they just got cold, and frostbite's that insidious thing that once it's frozen, it's okay. It doesn't hurt anymore. It's that stage between superficial frostbite and circulation, and that stage there, that's the stage that it hurts, where, everyone I'm sure has had that super cold morning when your hands have got super cold and numb, and then the feeling comes back, and it's, that stinging feeling.
And you're onto it pretty quickly, you realised what was happening.
We're trained paramedics. I'd studied frostbite, it's like the frostbite manual being enacted out right there in front of you. And it's like after 3 days, your big toe does go white and waxy.
Despite the lack of food and drink, the severe cold and the onset of frostbite, neither men gave up hope of making it out on their own 2 feet.
If we're going to get ourselves out, we've got to do it now, because if we wait longer, we're just going to get weaker and weaker. But we did actually try. We geared up, we put our harnesses on, we roped up, and we went outside the tunnel. We went 10 metres and we turned back because the weather was still crap, and we thought we'll last about an hour in this.
When do you start to think that this is getting a bit more serious than we banked on?
Oh, that's pretty definite, I think, about day 5.
As day 5 was the day that the frostbite had come right into my 4 feet anyway. But, you know, you knew you couldn't climb out. You knew you had to take the plastic shell off your boots because the swelling, the edema was just getting too tight. And that was the day that I went out onto the slope and put the ice screw in and attached my helmet to the slope on the outside.
It is a quirk of geography that the summit ridge of Mount Cook can be seen quite clearly on a good day from the visitors' centre or the hermitage at Mount Cook Village. And by putting his helmet outside their cave, Mark was counting on this being spotted by any rescuers when the weather cleared.
Because I knew from then on that we were reliant on being rescued, on not self-rescuing. So we were reliant on people knowing where we were. You know, I knew that when the weather would clear, if we weren't at a hut around the bottom, we would either be dead or we would have been there. It's the only logical place. It's where people had sheltered before. You know, it's institutional knowledge that it was always there. And so put that ice screw in and put the helmet on.
By now, day 5 in the ice cave, the search and rescue team at the HQ were aware that Phil and Mark, 2 of their members, were overdue.
And I know we knew they had gone climbing, and I'm pretty sure we were talking about it up in the snow cave.
Don Bogey, a senior member of the Face Rescue Team at Aoraki Mount Cook in 1982, a respected and very experienced mountaineer. Don was actually in a snow cave on a search and rescue training exercise at the very time when Mark and Phil were trapped in their crevasse.
So we got down, and then the talk changed to, well, Mark and Phil were overdue. That's when the formal SAR incident was turned on.
You realise that they're overdue and it probably was time to initiate the thing, but what could you actually practically do?
Yeah, well, sometimes you can't do anything. Sometimes you're going to go, the weather's bad, we don't actually know what happened. You sit through and work through the scenarios. If they caught out by bad weather and they're sheltering, they should be okay for a few days. You didn't need a lot of gear to survive up there as long as you're out of the wind. Maybe they could have fallen off, because quite a few people fall off the East Ridge. It's really icy up there and you're just exposed. It's one of the traps on it. You're actually sheltered from the westerly, and so you can keep on climbing on it and not realise how bad the weather is.
And this is not just speculation. Don is talking from experience, from a climb of Aoraki Mount Cook some 5 years before.
A guy I hadn't climbed with before, and I did these faces. It took quite a while. We got on top. It was really late, dark, gale force wind, and going, oh. And we sort of looked at each other and in the fading light and said, we'll probably fall off and die if we try and climb down now. So we found a little crevasse 50 feet down from the top, just big enough to crawl inside of, and the only spare gear we had with us, 2-person bivvy bag. We had no spare clothing, food or water, because we were trying to travel light. And so we got inside that and thought, okay, we'll have a really uncomfortable night and then we'll climb down tomorrow. But in the morning there was a huge blizzard blowing and couldn't see a thing, and gale force winds. So we had a second night, and so cold that to exhaust yourself shivering.
This should all be sounding very familiar. A late arrival on the summit ridge of Aoraki Mount Cook, travelling light with little food or water, and having to take refuge in a crevasse, expecting the weather to clear. The margins for survival under these circumstances can be fairly fine.
Yeah, after 2 nights the weather cleared and we just looked at each other and said, well, there's no one around here that can rescue us. At that time, no one had ever been rescued from that altitude, 12,500 feet before. because we climbed out and we spent 9 hours coming back to the hut. I guess I look back on that as a formative experience with my alpine climbing. I think the other guy I was with stopped climbing after that, but I decided, oh, this is interesting. I know I can really handle some pretty hard, mean conditions, and it also, I think, helped with my rescue work because I could understand what people could be going through when they're stuck on mountains.
So at the time of Phil and Mark's ordeal, isolated on the summit ridge of Aoraki Mount Cook, Don was in many ways the right person, at the right time, in the right place, for this particular rescue attempt.
So I was pretty conversant with the route and what they could find. So we thought, oh, well, as soon as the weather clears a bit, we'll do a heli reconnaissance and we'll check the high altitude hut, and just in case they've managed to get to them and the radio isn't working, and we'll check the fall zones.
A fall zone is the area below a mountain ridge or face, often quite high up, where bodies would fall if there was an accident. Sometimes equipment or slide marks or avalanche tracks can be seen that indicate where the bodies have fallen. 6 days after the climbers first took shelter in their inadequate crevasse, the weather did clear briefly, just enough for a reconnaissance flight. The chopper pilot was Ron Small, a veteran of mountain flying in the Alps.
They didn't know where they were, but they were overdue, and it was just howling northwest at altitude. We knew where the route that they were taking, so we spent quite a bit of time just looking where they might be, but the wind just never let up.
And we thought, oh, well, the cloud's gone up a bit, we'll go and sweep around the hill.
Don Bogey.
And we went up, and as we were flying around the bottom of the east ridge, the clouds started pulling up, and we went, oh yeah, we can get a bit higher up. And that was a mistake on that part, because we got up, and then the cloud formed around us and below us, and Ron was trying to hold a hover inside the cloud off a snow ridge.
Being caught in cloud with zero visibility is a pilot's worst nightmare. Being caught at over 3,000 metres near the summit ridge of Aoraki Mount Cook is another ballgame.
If that was now, the pilot would just fly away from the ridge and fly off on his GPS, go back somewhere. No GPSs then. And that was so close to crashing the machine, because I remember seeing the helicopter drifting sideways like this and seeing the ridge go underneath us, because he was trying to back down the ridge. And then, oh no, Ron just went, this isn't working. He says, I hope we come out of the cloud before we hit the ground. These days you'd stop the whole operation, do a debrief on that and reconsider your whole approach and what you were doing. But back then it was, oh well, that didn't work.
Meanwhile, with the winds not letting up, and now incapable of climbing down themselves, Phil and Mark survived as best they could. Still having no contact with the outside world and unaware of any rescue attempts taking place.
So what were your sort of spirits like during that time? I mean, did you both talk, or did you withdraw into yourself, or were you despair, or how did you deal with that? Because it's a serious situation.
Yeah, it was, and I think it was coming and going a bit. Sometimes we'd be talking about things, but at other times we were pretty quiet, particularly at night, and just shivering away. But I thought we managed to keep each other sort of pretty chipper, doesn't sound quite the right word, but confident that we could last it out.
You end up sleeping during the day a fair bit and you're awake during the night, and that's the worst bit, really, of that whole thing. It was a pretty unique situation, to have two search and rescue mountaineers, to have one of them that's been in the training and doing it for 3 years, full time, and the other one having experienced the same thing before, and also the differences between Phil and I just leap into things, whereas Phil's far more considered. On the lippy one, he's the strong, silent one, those sorts of things in many ways on reflection worked for us. We weren't great conversationalists, to say the least, but we were always focused on doing what we could to survive.
By now, the media was onto the story.
No, they can't be alive. They've got to be dead by now. No one can survive up there. But of course you can.
So where was that coming from, that thought that no, they can't survive this?
This was coming out of the media via commentators and pundits, and there was all sorts of people saying, oh no, we could go and do it, let us up there, we'll rescue it, and let's bring in some top climbers from elsewhere and they'll climb up there in the storm and lower them down.
It is hard to imagine the pressure that uninformed commentary from armchair experts and the media in general had on the rescue team. Outsiders simply did not understand the problems and risks involved in such a high-altitude rescue. While Aoraki Mount Cook can be seen quite easily from the park headquarters, what cannot be seen is the ferocious winds that make flying and rescue impossible, which led to frustrations on all sides. Pilot Ron Small was particularly affected.
Pressure from the media was enormous. The chief ranger at the time, Bert Youngman, did a marvellous job. He isolated us, like myself and the Alpine guys, the rescue guys, from the media fairly early on, because if they weren't getting the story, they were making it up. The stuff I read in the paper was just embarrassing.
Can you remember what things you read and you thought, oh, bullshit?
Yeah, there's big headlines, a helicopter crashed and nobody had.
So the media they were trying to get to you personally?
Oh yes, and sometimes you didn't know you were talking to them, They were from all over the world by that stage.
Oh, were they?
Japanese media were there, the BBC were there.
How did you sort of handle that?
Not very well.
It's like putting so much pressure on you.
That's right. Like we're all standing there and looking up the mountain, so when are you going to pick them up?
So we had a couple more days of bad weather. We got a bit of a clearance late in the day on day 7. We could actually see the summit ridge, so we went up to do a reconnaissance flight, and it was windy as. It was so windy, Ron couldn't hold a hover on the summit ridge, and we wanted to get a close look at that crevasse up near the summit middle peak, because that was a prime location to shelter. Yeah, so Ron would go out west and down low and ride the wind wave, and we'd zoom over top of the ridge and come back around again.
I must have been asleep, funnily enough, because my recollection is Mark sort of becoming aware that he could hear something other than the wind, because the wind is noisy and it was constant.
Phil Doole.
And then through the fog, so to speak, of just, being somewhat out of it, you heard this noise, which eventually we realised, shit, there's a helicopter out there. So I just happened to be the one who was nearest the door, so to speak. So I was the one who got up and went and had a look out. And yes, there was a chopper just up there. Chopper, yeah, Hotel Whiskey came up. I was bloody worried because I thought he'd already gone past us and missed us. Fortunately, they did a big orbit and then came back in at the same level and saw me waiting.
It wasn't until we'd been past a few times and Phil stuck his head out and we went, oh, there's someone there they are.
Sort of vaguely remember them sort of hovering there, and I was trying to tell them in sign language, which they never understood because I didn't have very good sign language, that the both of us were alive because Mark was still lying inside. But they flew away and came back again, and we heard them come back, so we went back outside.
Pilot Ron Small.
When the cloud lifted enough on Mount Cook, we found them in the schrund. It was just very, very windy, but it was sort of blowing over the summit ridge. It was 80, 100 knots, pretty limited what you could do. It was impossible to effect a rescue because you couldn't hover there. Like the updraft was just enormous. So we made up some food packs, and I reckon that we could whiz past the hole. We could fire them out the door.
So we did a couple of orbits where he'd come in low and then climb up, and we'd still be doing probably 30 or 40 knots as we went past the crevasse, and Ken and I would throw the bag out the door.
Anyway, all this stuff landed, I remember, and one bag hit me, and one bag, unfortunately, just I didn't see it or something, and it just slid off down the mountain. Fortunately, there were 4 of them.
A rescue attempt is expected soon to bring down the 2 climbers stranded for more than a week near the summit of Mount Cook. The pair, Mark Inglis and Phil Doole, were spotted in a helicopter sweep last night.
With food and water, stoves, sleeping bags and a radio for communication, and knowing that rescue was on its way, it looked likely that Phil and Mark's troubles were over.
I wasn't worried after that, and again, the whole thing is that neither of us, as far as I'm aware, thought that we had such serious frostbite.
So the wind's still too high to be rescued tonight, so we'll be out in the morning, The wind will drop and we'll be lifted out, It will have been a 7-day sojourn on the summit of Cook. And it didn't happen.
Far from being over, Phil and Mark's ordeal, although they didn't know it, had hardly begun. Next time, the efforts to rescue Phil and Mark continue.
We were reasonably optimistic we'd be able to do it in the next day or so with a gap in the weather, but the weather came in again.
Rescuers watched some of the worst weather the mountains ever produced, waiting for that break of just a few hours to launch the rescue.
And then it got harder, and it just got harder, and it got harder as the days went on.
Steve, we know that a walkie-talkie was dropped off to the two men, but there's been no radio contact, or at least that was the last report. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
Their connection with the outside world is a mixed blessing.
Probably one of the hardest things is they put Anne on the radio the next morning, and that changes your whole attitude, really.
And grave fears were held for their safety as the storm raged on.
So I was being asked about, how long could they survive, and we were pretty concerned about hypothermia versus frostbite.
And things began to go wrong.
The Iroquois came right down alongside us, and we could feel the downwash, but then suddenly there was some thudding and silence.
That's next time on Search and Rescue NZ. Thanks to the producers of this series, Phil Vine, Justine Murray and Justin Gregory. Thanks to Ben Pearce, the engineer for this episode. Production coordinator, Brianna Juratich-Gregg. Executive audio editor, Tim Watkin. Find and follow Search and Rescue NZ on your favourite podcast app or at rnz.co.nz/podcasts. Kia ora and thanks for listening.